I'm delighted to welcome this evening Liam Laurence Smyth CB, who many of you will know both as a colleague and as a long-serving member of the Study of Parliament group. Liam has recently moved into what I think it's fair to describe as semi-retirement, so he's still with us, not quite gone yet, but no longer full-time in his previous role as Clerk of Legislation. And he is one of the few clerks who I think would remember still working with Michael Ryle, who is still one of the few clerks still working at Westminster, who would remember working with Michael Ryle. And can I also welcome Michael's family who are joining us tonight, Nick, who I think is here in person, and Joe, who is joining us online. Those of you who have worked with Liam will know how generous he is in making time to share his knowledge and expertise with colleagues both at Westminster and beyond. So we're delighted that he's willing to do so yet again this evening, and we're very grateful to have him. And we will follow the usual format this evening, which will be the lecture followed by Q&A on the Chatham House rule, and then we'll have some more refreshments in the room next door. So without anything else to say, I will hand over to Liam Laurence Smyth. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm just so honoured to be invited to give the 2024 Michael Ryle Memorial Lecture. It's the 10th anniversary, I believe, of the first Ryle Lecture given by Speaker Bercow in 2014. It's an unaccustomed experience for me to speak publicly about a career that for the most part has been in the background, but here I am on the front page of the New York Times. It's a particular pleasure for me to be asked to give this lecture since Michael Ryle was a significant early influence on my career. And when I went to Windsor Castle recently to receive my CB from the Princess Royal, I wore this very tie. It's the Society of Clerks at the Table in Commonwealth Parliaments, and it's known in my household as my Michael Ryle tie. My career as a clerk spans a period of more than 46 years, during which time I've served under 12 clerks of the House. Here they are, and half a dozen speakers. And there have been about 5, I would say, significant electoral turning points. 79, the defeat of the Labour government, as described in James Graham's This House, ushering in the Thatcher era, which among other things recast the Select Committee system. 1997, the modernisation of the House of Commons under the Blair government. 2010, coalition government following the Spencer scandal. 26, the Brexit referendum. And 2024, bringing in a majority of members new to the House. So in what follows, there are some gaps, and there are some loose threads, and there are some hints of topics, which I might be able to discuss in Q&A once the recording has stopped, or in conversations over drinks afterwards, or quite possibly not at all. Now, copies of my CV are available in the room in case you wanted to raise anything I don't mention. Our calling as clerks is to serve the central institution of our democracy to the best of our ability and not to use our privileged inside position to advance our own political opinions. And Michael Ryle was inspirational for many of us in combining high standards of service to Parliament with a commitment to reform based on a deep understanding of procedure as exemplified in the Study of Parliament group, which he co-founded with Professor Bernard Crick, which brings us all here today. My talk comes in 3 parts: select committees, interparliamentary relations, and legislation. So for select committees, when I joined the House in 1977, entering as a PP graduate through the Civil Service Selection Board competition, now branded as the Fast Stream, Michael Ryle was clerk of select committees, heading up a small outpost of the committee office on the 3rd floor of 3 Dean's Yard. And in Dean's Yard, I took over the glamorously named Subcommittee B of the Select Committee on Nationalised Industries, just as it was embroiled in a row with the Department of Industry over the financial forecasts of the British Steel Corporation. Now, the Select Committee ordered the relevant documents to be handed over by the BSC chairman, Sir Charles Villiers, a distinguished veteran of the Special Operations Executive, who was nicknamed Mr. Pastry by the press, owing to his supposed likeness to a character from a children's TV programme. And the actual order was delivered not by the Sergeant-at-Arms in person, but by Mary Frampton, warrant officer of the House, clerk in charge of the Sergeant-at-Arms office, who acquired an unsought notoriety as the House's enforcer, and she later performed the same service for another committee in 1982 in relation to Arthur Scargill, General Secretary of the National Union of Mine Workers. A more fruitful and innovative venture by Subcommittee B was the pre-legislative scrutiny of plans to reorganise the electricity supply industry. Now, the publication by the Secretary of State for Energy of an entire draft bill, for which, owing to the Lib Lab Pact, he was denied cabinet clearance, was an instance of Tony Benn's willingness to break the mould. Other examples include disclaiming his hereditary peerage, issuing thematic postage stamps, and securing the suspension of collective responsibility for the 1975 EEC referendum, in which I had voted as a student. Now, in the case of Benn's proposed recasting of the nationalised electricity sector, what emerged was an utter lack of support for the Liberals' alternative approach, on which David Penhaligon's veto of Benn's bill had been based. Although I was rather sorry to see the demise of the Select Committee on Nationalised Industries in 1979, I rejoiced in taking up a post in the Palace with a lovely river view as Assistant Clerk of the departmentally related Agriculture Committee, charged with monitoring the Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Food. And owing to divisions within both parties over Europe, we soon learned to steer clear of debating the merits of the Commons agricultural policy whenever possible. Now, when I was in the Journal office in the mid-1980s, I was the clerk of a Select Committee on Standing Orders Revision, which brought about the withholding of salary during a member's suspension. I had part-time duties as clerk of the Select Committee on Sound Broadcasting in those pre-televising days, and a subcommittee of the Select Committee on House of Common Services on computers. And we wondered if email might have a future. I also clerked the New Building Subcommittee under John Silkin, which produced the design brief for the buildings from 1 Parliament Street to 1 Derby Gate, and which made a start on plans to redevelop the tube station site, which ultimately resulted in the building we're in now. A career highlight for me in the private bill office was the Select Committee on the Channel Tunnel Bill. A series of sittings in the summer recess 1986, based at the Imperial Hotel in Hythe, got through a very large number of individuals, helpfully outnumbered by the no-shows. I sometimes wear my souvenir Eurotunnel tie on the Eurostar train, bearing the number 4266. It's the number of petitions lodged against the bill in the private bill office. And after, well, almost 20 years after Subcommittee B had examined Tony Benn's draft bill, I conducted another pre-legislative inquiry after Harriet Harman, the Secretary of State for Social Security, published clauses on pension sharing on divorce, which was scrutinised by the Social Security Select Committee. I'd become clerk of that committee in 1994, just after the criminal case that commenced against the Maxwell brothers, which fortunately meant that its chair, Frank Field, had to turn his attention to other matters. Among my successes in that role was persuading Frank to travel. Initially, a committee trip to Switzerland in March 1995. I knew we'd get the funding because the liaison committee was keen to reduce its underspend before the end of the financial year, and I could promise Frank that he would not miss any important votes because we'd be travelling in a week when the whips were focused on the Cheltenham Gold Cup. We went on a longer comparative study visit to Australia, New Zealand and Singapore in November 95, where the members laid their wreaths on a lovely summer Remembrance Day in Canberra. And the following year, the BBC foolishly attempted an undercover expose by secretly following the committee to Chile in September 96. They should have known that Frank would be the last person to go on a boondoggle. Examining the privatised state pension reforms forced through by General Pinochet and similar less draconian state pension policies in Argentina played a large part in the evolution of Frank's thinking on how to rebuild the UK's national insurance system. His mandate from Tony Blair to think the unthinkable as Minister of State for Welfare Reform, founded on scepticism from Gordon Brown's Treasury, and both Harriet Harman and Frank Field were dismissed after just a year in office. Of all the chairs I worked with, Barry Shearman on the Education Committee was the only one who ever actively sought my feedback on his own performance. And before what one former Prime Minister described as the rigmarole of September sittings, introduced by a girly swat predecessor to show the public that MPs were earning their crust, the Education Committee attempted to use a non-sitting week in September for a residential week in Birmingham, which combined visits, formal evidence sessions, open forums, covering all the different sectors of education. I'd so like to report that that was a successful experiment, but it was weakened by the indifference and absence of opposition members on the committee. As clerk of the journals, I had a really uncomfortable experience of being clerk to the committee chaired by Ben Campbell, holding to account almost all of those involved in the Damien Green case. The Clerk of the House, Speaker's Council, the Sergeant at Arms, and the by then former Speaker Martin, as well as the Cabinet Secretary, the Metropolitan Police and Damien Green. I think it's not unfair to say only the last name wasn't at all criticised by the committee. In the aftermath of the expenses scandal, the incoming coalition government produced a green paper on parliamentary privilege in 2012. Eventually, a joint committee was appointed, which I was the lead Commons clerk, to consider the green paper. Now, the weight given by the committee to the opinion in favour of a Privileges Act by the authoritative figure of Sir Malcolm Jack, the former Clerk of the House, might have been greater were it not for the diametrically opposed and equally authoritative view of the incumbent Clerk of the House, Sir Robert Rogers, now Lord Lisvane. So the Joint Committee came out in July 2013 against a privileges statute, and the matter was quietly dropped, at least for a while. Another joint committee which came my way was the draft House of Lords Reform Bill, and a great opportunity was lost with Labour's refusal to vote for the bill's programme motion in July 2012. Select committee clerks, they need intellectual curiosity, the ability to master a subject sufficiently to examine clearly to MPs what the experts are arguing about. They need drafting skills to present evidence clearly and to express conclusions on which the chair should be able to reach a consensus in the committee, and an underpinning of procedural knowledge, not just to keep the select committee within its remit, but also, as with Mary Frampton, to be able to exploit opportunities when they arise. Michael Ryle was a great internationalist and an enthusiastic supporter of links with clerk colleagues in the Commonwealth. And unusually, I had 3 spells in the Overseas Office, 1981 to 1982, arranging to host the European speakers of the North Atlantic Assembly, what we now call NATO PA conferences in London, when Michael Ryle was clerk of the Overseas Office. 1987 to 1990, as secretary to the UK delegations to the parliamentary assemblies of the Council of Europe, Western European Union, NATO and the OSCE, and as clerk of the Overseas Office, now more prosaically called Director of Interparliamentary Relations, from 2005 to 2008. And encouraged by Michael, I took up opportunities to learn about other parliaments, such as being a note taker at the annual Westminster seminars of the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association, and acquiring the technique of reported speech stood me in good stead for working as part of the temporary teams in support of plenary sessions in Strasbourg, Paris, various NATO or OSCE capitals, and even once in Santiago for the IPU. I was fortunate to be delegation secretary in the dramatic period from 1987 to 1990, which saw the fall of the Berlin Wall. And I was in the Strasbourg hemicycle for Mikhail Gorbachev's landmark declaration in July 1989, when he ruled out any use of force between or within alliances in our common European home. At the following September sitting, the UK delegation planned to host a reception to showcase the best of British food and drink and to commemorate the 40th anniversary of the Council of Europe. And the centrepiece of that event was to be a sunset ceremony with beating retreat by the Royal Marines. A few days before the band from the Royal School of Music was due in Strasbourg, several bandsmen were murdered at their barracks in Deal by a provisional IRA bomb. Rather than call off the event, the Commandant General ordered another Royal Marines band from the Commando Training School in Lympstone to drive through the night to fulfill the Marines' commitment. That event, celebrating the UK's role in the parent organisation of the European Convention of Human Rights, was all the more moving and memorable for its defiance of the enemies of democracy. In later years, I took on more senior procedural roles in the temporary teams, ending up as procedural advisor to the Parliamentary Assembly of the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And in connection with the latter role, I'm grateful to the House for supporting me in learning Russian, including a daily one-to-one beginners course at the Diplomatic Service Language Centre during the 1997 election, and a residential course in St. Petersburg during the election of 2001. And around the turn of the century, I took over from Helen Irwin a part-time responsibility as director of our parliamentary cooperation programme with the Russian State Duma. And this series of professional development seminars in the UK and Moscow was administered by the British Council, paid for by the FCO's Know-How Fund, which is a forerunner of the Westminster Fund for Democracy. And it's rather melancholy to look back now on how we welcomed the advent of Vladimir Putin as a figure of promise in Yeltsin's presidential administration, who might bring a degree of discipline into the Duma's legislative program, which was rather chaotic at that time. My life changed in July 2013 when I accompanied Speaker Berco's delegation to Burma, where he introduced me to Daw Aung San Suu Kyi as someone who could help make a democratic reality of the Burmese parliament. The tricameral Pidong Su Klutor was something of a Frankenstein's monster or a Potemkin village, having been cobbled together by the military regime in order to persuade the international community to lift sanctions. And Edward Wood from the House of Commons Library and I worked together with Moira Fraser, an inspirational former parliamentary librarian from New Zealand, to foster the development of an impartial research service for the fledgling parliament. And Oliver Bennett took up a year-long residential position in Naypyidaw as the pathfinder, what grew into our most sustained bilateral parliamentary development programme, with up to half a dozen UK Parliament staff posted there for full-time on-site training, coaching and mentoring. And as the project matured, we moved into supporting committee work and human resources. And I visited Myanmar more than a dozen times over the life of the project, which was approaching its end as COVID struck in 2020 and was irrevocably terminated with a military coup a year later. It remains one of the great privileges of my life to have known Daw Suu, who remains under house arrest. It was very inspiring to work with a new generation of Burmese officials striving to foster a democratic culture as their country emerged from decades of brutal, incompetent and corrupt military dictatorship. Today, it's the anniversary of the execution of Ko Phyo Zeathor. He's the man bottom right there with Daw Suu, the former hip-hop artist and National League for Democracy MP. He'd always stop to chat with us in the refreshment area just outside one of the Lutor's three chambers. The Westminster Parliament is widely admired and respected, which gives us the opportunity and responsibility to assist in breathing life into democratic institutions. A clerk has to really understand Westminster procedures in order to engage internationally, as well as having the ability to communicate at the right level. But even more important than either expertise or communication is a certain modesty or even humility in understanding how closely connected specific national cultures and contexts are for sustainable democratic development. In 2014, I became Clerk of Legislation, in which post I continued up to the end of May this year. As the number of private bills has declined since the advent of the Transport and Works Act, the private bill office is now merged In the Public Bill Office, we have a trickle of hybrid bills on large infrastructure projects like Crossrail and HS2. The government was rather put out when, as Clerk of Legislation, I caused their Holocaust Memorial Bill to be referred to the examiners, who decided that it was a hybrid bill. And the Holocaust Memorial Bill has just been reintroduced, and it's now in the House of Lords. My duties in the Public Bill Office included corresponding in confidence on government bills with the excellent Office of Parliamentary Counsel, giving confidential advice to the Speaker and Deputy Speakers on the application of the Parliament Act, the interpretation of standing orders, and advising members and the Chair privately on the orderliness of amendments. My term spanned a decade from James Wharton's European Union Referendum Private Members Bill through the actual Referendum Act, later meaningful votes, post-Brexit bills, right up to the recent super fast spin cycle in the pre-election wash-up. So the parliamentary battle over Brexit has been delineated superbly by Meg Russell and Lisa James, who are with us today. I personally was very glad to see the back of English votes for English laws, those standing orders, that were suspended for sheer practicality during hybrid sittings in the pandemic and then quietly rescinded. The preparation with the Speaker's Council of evil certificates and checking the Speaker's chamber script, the dossier, the ensuing choreography of legislative grand committee stages used to take up a lot of my time, but I can't think of a single change made to any bill as a result of a vote being held under the evil standing orders. Now, in my time, we had several fast-track Northern Ireland bills, and on one occasion, I helped the Northern Ireland members to amend an otherwise extremely narrow bill, postponing Northern Ireland Assembly elections yet again, by letting the government know that the Speaker was minded to select an instruction allowing the bill to be used to bring into force an uncommenced Northern Ireland legislation on organ donation, Dahi's law. And that's a picture of the little lad who's on the organ transplant, and now in Northern Ireland there's a presumption in favour of donation. Northern Ireland MPs were similarly successful in getting the quashing of sub-postmaster convictions in the province included in what was expressly designed to be an England and Wales only bill. Now, not long after he retired, Michael Ryle served as secretary of the Hansard Commission on the Legislative Process, chaired by Lord Geoffrey Rippon, who acknowledged the momentum and vision that Michael brought to the drafting of the report. The Hansard Commission's proposals, all the way back in 1992, included publication of explanatory notes on bills, it's now the norm, referral of complex government bills to a first reading committee to take evidence and report observations before second reading, which personally I still think a good idea, or evidence taken after second reading in special standing, what we now call public bill committees, which is now the norm for programmed government bills, except for reasons that beat me, in the case of finance bills and bills originating in the Lords. And the Hansard Commission also recommended more extensive and routine programming of all legislation. Now, as far as general committees go, it seems to me it's not the rules of procedure, but the adversarial political culture that makes them such a waste of time, at least as far as government backbenchers are concerned. Particularly on delegated legislation committees, the attendance of government members serves no purpose other than to overfulfill the quorum, since any divisions on the technical has considered motion have no effect. An instant reform would be reduce the quorum for delegated legislation committees to no more than 3. In these days of modernised sitting hours, deferred divisions, and a parallel debating chamber in Westminster Hall, we could surely devise less cumbersome machinery for debating affirmative statutory instruments, perhaps even returning more delegated legislation debates to the floor of the House after the main business of the day is concluded. And I think the backbench business committee should be permitted to table debates on prayers against statutory instruments. But programming works pretty well, in my view, in public bill committees. Certainly by comparison to bad old days, clocking up 100 hours to force the government into tabling a guillotine motion. Now, over my decade as clerk of legislation, the logic of programming has resulted in the norm for report stages now being a single miscellaneous debate, often with time limits on backbench speeches, and ending in no more than a handful of divisions on amendments selected for separate decision by the Speaker. And I would say that for a procedural clerk, most valuable quality is empathy. It's not sufficient just to rule something out of order. That leads to frustration at supposedly arcane rules. If we take the time to explain how things work, most members will accept that what we have are actually perfectly sensible ways of doing business. Now, in study of Parliament group circles, we have a tendency to slip into the fallacy that Parliament is on the other side from government. But in the elusive ambivalence of the Westminster system of blended parliamentary government, both main parties share a common interest in winning power so that they can get stuff done. Clerks help to ensure, as Robin Cook put it, that good scrutiny makes for good government. Later this week, the House will debate the terms of reference of a modernisation committee tasked with driving up standards, improving working practices, and reforming procedures. And that seems a good point in which to bring this lecture to a close with a quotation from Michael Ryle from Commons in the 70s. This is Michael speaking. Personally, I'm convinced that the House of Commons, provided it develops effective and critical procedures to match the power of government, and provided it always speaks for and to the people, will continue to be a lively, effective and influential body which our system of parliamentary democracy requires. Thank you.